Well, hello once again, and welcome to the last of our lectures on the foundations of Western civilization, number 48. In this lecture, what we're going to do is perch ourselves in a way sort of in the early 17th century. We're going to look around, see what we notice, and we're going to look back, and we're going to look forward. We'll try, in a sense, to draw together some of the themes and issues that we've encountered throughout these lectures. We'll try to suggest one or two things about the directions that things might be expected to take in the centuries that would come after. You'll perhaps recall that on many occasions I've said, well, what if we played the time traveler game and we could stop the clock at certain points and visit there and ask ourselves, well, what do we think is going to happen next? Well, we'll kind of do that again, and in slightly larger terms, perhaps, in this very last lecture. Well, first of all, let's sketch in what we might call the geopolitical background. How did this world shape up politically in the late 16th to 17th centuries? Across the course of the 16th century, we can see the emergence of the kind of great power politics and diplomacy that would actually dominate the West until the collapse of the Soviet Empire in 1989. The collapse of the Soviet Empire, of course, left us with a unipolar world. I mean, in a certain sense, the entire political and diplomatic heritage, military heritage too, to a degree, was sort of left in the hands of the United States, which is obviously not yet a player in the 16th century. But this process, what we see around us in the world today, is the culmination of a rather coherent process that reaches back a long time. Now, if I call it a system, a great power system, let's be very clear. It was not a system in the sense that someone sat down and thought it up. But the diplomatic and political, the international system, if you like, from the 16th century until the late 20th, was one that consisted basically of a series of shifting patterns of alliances among the greatest European powers, with the smaller powers aligning themselves, or perhaps being forced to align themselves, with their more powerful neighbors. Now, in the context of Europe, the first fundamental aspect of this system was the Habsburg-Valois rivalry. That is, the struggle between the Valois rulers, the rulers of the Valois dynasty in France, and the Habsburg rulers of the Spanish Empire and the Holy Roman Empire. Now, how had this come about? Well, it had come about in a way that would be sort of impossible in the modern world, but was still very much a part of this early modern world that we have been talking about. It was a series of dynastic marriages effecting actually two great unions that then culminated in one stupendous dynastic arrangement. Okay, very quickly, here's what happened. Maximilian of Austria, the Holy Roman Emperor, married Mary of Burgundy. Now, Mary of Burgundy was the heiress to both Burgundy, a substantial chunk of eastern France, and the Netherlands. They had a son, Philip. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile married, as we have seen, and unified the Spanish crowns, the crowns of Castile and Aragon. They had a daughter, Johanna. Johanna and Philip married, creating a Habsburg sphere of influence that reached all over Europe and, owing to the Spanish conquests in the New World, extended to the Americas as well. Thus far, the Habsburg situation. Now, under Philip II of Spain, a huge imperial realm existed, but eventually, as he approached his own death, came in 1556, he divided his realms such that his brother Ferdinand took the Austrian lands, while Charles V took Spain, its overseas possessions, and to a degree, its interests in the Italian peninsula as well. These Habsburg lands, one has only to think about it for a moment, surrounded France. So a great deal of French policy was addressed to eluding domination by this sort of massive Habsburg monster that had them surrounded. In the 17th century, French policy is most evident, for example, in the support given to Protestant Sweden and to North German states in their battles during the so-called 30 Years' War in Germany against the Austrian Habsburgs. Now, the French were Catholics. You might have thought that they'd have lent support to the Catholic Habsburgs to suppress Protestant northern Germany. Oh no. The French interest was to weaken the Habsburgs, so they lent support to Protestant enemies in North Germany of Catholic Austria. Likewise, for example, when the Netherlands rebelled against Spain, the southern Netherlands, you remember, were largely Catholic, generally loyal, basically what we think of as Belgium. But the northern Netherlands, what we think of today as Holland or the Netherlands, strictly speaking, were Calvinists. They chafed under Spanish authority. They rebelled against the Spanish, and the French assisted the Dutch. Now again, we might have thought, well, the Catholic French should have aided their Catholic Spanish brethren, to suppress these rebellious Calvinist Dutchmen. No, no. The French wanted to weaken the Spanish Habsburgs. So we're beginning to see a kind of diplomacy that is based upon the very careful calculation of interests. Now, this can sometimes encounter the naivete of modern peoples. There was, for example, the situation in recent times when Charles de Gaulle pulled France out of NATO. And people said, you're abandoning your friends. And in his haughty sort of way, de Gaulle says, France has no friends, France has interests. Well, that kind of diplomacy. Maybe we could call it Machiavellian, a kind of diplomacy that simply grapples with the world the way it really is and brutally, roughly calculates interests. Now, the Spanish, to be sure, saw themselves in some ways as the protectors and saviors of Catholic Europe, even though Catholic France opposed them mightily. So, for example, the Spanish put together a great naval force that fought and defeated the Turks, no small thing, this, at the Battle of Lepanto in the eastern Mediterranean in 1571. One of the sailors in those Spanish ships at Lepanto was a man named Miguel de Cervantes, of whom we would hear something as an author later on, the author of Don Quixote. In 1588, the Spanish launched the Invincible Armada, an enormous naval fleet designed to conquer Protestant England and to restore the true faith there. The Armada, for lots of reasons, which it would be very interesting to pursue, though we haven't time to do so here, was defeated. But for the next several decades, over much of the globe, the Spanish and the English navies combated each other. The period also saw an escalation of colonial rivalries. For example, by the time the 17th century dawns, both France and England begin to build overseas empires in North America. Now, we saw before that they had made the first faint stirrings in this direction at the end of the 15th century, but then for a long time were distracted by other concerns. Now, when the English and the French began to build their realms in North America, they were looking for the northwest passage to Asia, trying to find a way to get to the east by going west. Partly they were entering lands that, after all, had been left free by the Spanish. The Spanish had taken most of the southern regions of what would later become the United States, had taken Central America, had taken South America. The English and the French went north. Partly, also, they were combating each other as religious rivals, the English Protestant, the French Catholic. The Dutch, once freed of Spanish dominance, began themselves to build a colonial regime. The Dutch regime was built very much more like the Portuguese, however, than like the Spanish. That is to say, the Dutch created a series of trading stations in the Indian Ocean basin and in the South China Sea, and also, eventually, in the Americas. Now, the Dutch and the English, although both Protestant states, with natural foes, we might have thought, in France and in Spain, actually fought a bloody series of wars with one another, occasioned by their competing economic interests around the world. Now, just very briefly, we might say that at the end of the 17th century, the Russia of Peter the Great began to enter the picture as another key player on the European stage. We don't really have time to pursue the ins and outs of Russian history here. But let us say that by 1700, so we can just put Peter the Great and his Russia into the picture, two great patterns are evident. The first, shifting combinations of England, Holland, France, Spain, German states, Austria, Russia, and Turkey would dominate the European scene. Now, it has been the despair of every student who went through modern European history and had to memorize the lists of parties that were signatory to all the treaties or who fought each other in all the wars of modern European history. But just to remember those school days is to remember how often these alliances shifted. But the point is, these are the players. Between the middle of the 16th and the end of the 17th century, they're all in the game, as it were. Second great point. As these states consolidated and even expanded their overseas holdings, Europe's struggles were globalized. At once, problems on the world frontier became problems in Europe. Problems in Europe became problems on the world frontier. Closely connected to that, of course, the European economy became dependent on raw materials from and commerce with, often on terms rigged to serve the interests of Europeans, but commerce with overseas realms. The globe was stitched together in ways that had never been true before. The second important way, we can say that the dawning modern world manifested itself in what we sometimes call the scientific revolution. Now, is it legitimate to use the word revolution here? Remember, we had a little fun with the word revolution way back in early lectures when we talked about the Neolithic revolution that took a very long time, centuries, millennia, to work itself out. Well, the scientific revolution is something that at the very least took decades, maybe indeed something like a century and a half to work itself out. So another fairly leisurely revolution from one point of view. From another point of view, the scientific revolution does mark a fairly dramatic change in worldview. A fairly dramatic change in worldview. Now, the process is usually associated with a series of discoveries in astronomy. We could actually, were we to focus on the scientific revolution itself for itself, we could expand this discussion quite broadly. But generally speaking, one way to tell the story is to talk about astronomy. In 1543, Nicholas Copernicus, Polish scholar, who was born in 1473, lived until, indeed, the very end of his life was 1543, published his On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Bodies. On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Bodies. Now, in this book, which he dedicated to the Pope, interesting footnote, he carefully advanced the heliocentric theory, the idea that the Earth and all the planets revolve around the sun. Now, he wasn't the first to argue this view, but his views did not in his own time win universal assent. Indeed, they won rather limited assent. Indeed, the tradition at that point was still very much against him. In 1576, the King of Denmark financed the construction of an observatory for Tycho Brahe. Brahe was born in 1546. He died in 1601. We see again the role of patronage here, the importance of finding wealthy, influential supporters who will make various kinds of intellectual endeavors possible. Well, Brahe's contribution was the collection of an enormous amount of data from close, careful observation on the movements of the stars and the planets. Before him, one of the curious ironies in the sense of Renaissance imperatives, before him, virtually everyone had relied on the quite imprecise data of the ancients. But ancients sometimes had such standing, such authority, that discovering ancient texts and reading ancient texts seemed somehow to convey truth, full stop, you see. Well, no, Brahe starts to study the heavens again. Now, Brahe's greatest pupil was the German Johannes Kepler. Kepler was born in 1571, lived until 1630. Those who have studied mathematics, those who have studied physics, those who have studied a variety of disciplines, thermodynamics, for example, have encountered Kepler in a variety of ways. And the things that we think of Kepler as being famous for manifest themselves right here in his astronomical work. To what did that work address itself? This problem. No one, not Copernicus, no one, had ever adequately accounted for the seeming peculiarities in planetary motion. Now, there had been some fairly wild and fantastic theories advanced, lots of false trails blazed, but what Kepler eventually came to realize is that planetary motion could only be explained by sophisticated mathematical models. It was now not the application, as it were, of philosophical first principles, but the application of mathematical models to planetary motion to explain how did these planets move through their elliptical orbits. And that, of course, is, among other things, one of the great issues, one of the great points for which Kepler is remembered, his gifts as a mathematician. Now this brings me to Galileo Galilei, 1564 to 1642. He built on the work of his predecessors and proved, basically mathematically, that the Earth moves. Now, it's easy to misunderstand what was at stake here. People have probably heard, for example, about Galileo's struggles with the church, and their natural instinct leads them to see, the natural instinct of the dawning third millennium, leads them to see wisdom and truth being crushed by superstition and coercion. Well, as always, it's not quite that simple. Galileo's views, for example, were not then dominant. It is in retrospect that we see clearly that he was right. It was not clear that he was right in the middle of the 17th century. In point of fact, the whole Western tradition was against him. All of the Greeks, Aristotle, the master of those who know. So, in a sense, if you're choosing up sides, then you choose this sort of upstart new guy, or you choose the whole tradition. But there was something else at issue, and Galileo did win in the end, after all. But there's something else at issue. Is precise observation and mathematical demonstration to be permitted to trump centuries of accumulated wisdom? If the West has built up its traditions over a long period of time and has taught them and has conserved them and has handed them on lovingly and faithfully, generation to generation, can they then be so quickly dismissed? Simply because, as it were, proven wrong? Was it the role of science to confirm both revealed truths and common sense? Does grace perfect nature, as theologians had said? Or was science itself superior? It's fascinating, isn't it, to reflect on the fact that the earliest manifestations of what I suggested to you were science occurred as Mesopotamians stared inquisitively at the heavens arrayed above themselves. Nearly 5 millennia later, a tradition, already then thousands of years old, was overturned when new people gazed at those same stars. We noticed that in Hellenistic times there was already beginning to be some hint of the split between the two cultures, the culture of arts and letters and the culture of science. And yet the medieval, and even to a degree the Renaissance curriculum of the arts, of the 7 liberal arts, had urged an integrated view of knowledge. How often today do we worry about the fact that we have illiterate scientists, that is to say, scientists without letters, and that we have lettered people who are without understanding of scientific world, or who are innumerate, who cannot do simple mathematics. We still quest for integrated view of knowledge, even as in certain respects our tendency to ever greater specialization tells us, almost instinctively, that we cannot have this goal. A biblical worldview held that the world was created by God and that science was God's gift to those humans who wished to explore God's purposes. Now that, too, was an integrated view. And yet, from the 17th century, science comes to be seen as a distinct and highly specialized way of knowing. And in some people's minds, a superior, and to some people's minds, indeed, the only final way of knowing. Aristotle had thought poets capable of apprehending and telling the highest truth. This is harder to believe, I suppose, after the scientific revolution. It's also true that science became increasingly professionalized, in addition to being increasingly specialized. Think of the vast array of learned societies which in today's world carefully guard the information within particular fields of study and credential those who wish to practice one or another scientific craft. Now, many of the great modern academies are themselves products of the 17th, or perhaps in some cases the very early 18th century. But it is certainly true that no Mesopotamian, no Persian, no Greek carried a membership card in a learned society and didn't pay dues to any organization and go to annual conventions and meet all his buddies. We began with tiny cities in Sumer, little bitty cities, little city-states. Cities have been a constant concern for us throughout these lectures, and yet the world was profoundly rural. One of the interesting paradoxes of the Western tradition, of Western civilization, is we think of it as an urban phenomenon, and yet, in point of fact, through most of its course, the overwhelming majority of people lived in the countryside. For instance, the first British census that showed more people living in cities than in small towns or rural communities was collected in 1850. That point was not reached in the United States until 1920. So despite the importance of cities, the vigor of cities, the interest of cities, the clear place of great ancient cities, Athens and Rome, the importance of Renaissance cities like Florence, the importance of medieval cities like Paris, we are always dealing with a world that was overwhelmingly rural. Now, in the period roughly 1500 to 1750, the period we're sort of speaking about at the moment, cities anchored themselves really as the decisive elements in the demographic and thus, by extension, in the economic and political landscape. Initially, we may say, for instance, that in this particular period, the greatest growth was in medium-sized cities, for instance, in the British Midlands, for instance, in the Low Countries, for instance, in the Rhineland. In other words, the great story here is not Rome, Paris, London. The great story here is Manchester, Birmingham, you see, is Liège in Belgium, is towns in the Rhineland, and so on. The faint beginnings of urban industrialization were apparent, with all the social and political problems that process has entailed ever since. The world is going to become increasingly urban, and cities are going to continue to play an enhanced set of roles that are not new in the modern world as compared to earlier times, but that intensify. The psalmist cried out, "What is man that thou art mindful of him?" By the 17th century, as we've seen, a wide array of answers had been given to that question. The great political upheavals of the 18th century, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Enlightenment, would provide yet further answers to that question, some of them predictable out of earlier experience, some of them slightly new. But let's just remind ourselves of some of the ways that question had been answered in the centuries before the 18th. A skeptic might have said, "There is no God." That's a foolish way of putting the question. But there are lots more skeptics now than there were then. Most would not then have formulated their response to that question in that way. Thomas Hobbes, following certainly in the tracks of St. Augustine and of John Calvin, said that man was a wretched creature, sinful, monstrous, criminal, and always to be restrained as much as possible for fear of what he might do to himself or to others. Not a very happy or optimistic take on the human experience was Hobbes's, man who lived in a primitive state of nature where life was poor, solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. The last defenders of monarchy said that man was a creature most happy when he submitted willingly to those in authority and recognized the God-given order of the state and of the universe. Well, that was an argument much heard in the 17th century. I dare say not an argument much heard in our own times. Though, do we hear an echo of it in the idea that a responsible, dedicated, and submitted citizenry is a happy one? There was already, in the time of the Renaissance, we spoke of Renaissance civic humanism. Certainly there was time in there was occasion in the writing of some great 17th century political thinkers to turn to what comes to be called the liberal tradition. The liberal tradition says that man is endowed with rights, and that he needed to use those rights to their fullest in free and open societies in order to be fully human. Now, this line of thinking reaches right back over the Renaissance. It reaches right back to Cicero. It reaches right back to Aristotle. We've encountered it again and again. The interesting problem with this theory is that however lofty it is in articulation, however attractive it is in theory, it has been immensely difficult to implement in practice. In how many societies have free people been able freely to govern themselves? An ideal long called for, but not one widely accepted or used. Western civilization, it seems to me, and finally, has been one long test of human ingenuity in the face of the natural world. Mesopotamians and Egyptians, for example, learned to harness the power of rivers to tame the challenges of the desert, to feed themselves, quite simply. For millennia, the Mediterranean provided food, it linked peoples, and it transmitted ideas. Our sea, Mare Nostrum, as the Romans called it, was the center of the earth as far as people were concerned. Naval technologies, commercial technologies, we might say, were elaborated and developed to profit from the inland sea. Continental Europeans and their island neighbors spread in every direction, as we've had occasion to see. First of all, of course, spreading out on the European continent itself. Remember our expanding Europe of the High Middle Ages? And then spread, well, yes, in the first place to places like Iceland, and then eventually almost all the globe. They applied ever new technologies, from such humble things, remember, in the early Middle Ages as iron plows and three-field systems and better water wheels, to the more elaborate technologies of modern times. But we have here again a long continuity. We will not speak in this course, but we would be able to speak if we were looking into the future, of the so-called agricultural revolution of the 18th century. That is to say, another moment in the history of the West when agricultural technology grew and expanded as almost never before. Indeed, an important background to the slightly later Industrial Revolution. So conquering the natural world, solving its problems, learning how to cope with it, has been a continuous story. Those technologies that Europeans developed for their sailing, better maps, yes, but also better ships, yes, but also better navigational instruments, yes, better rigging for ships, yes, all of these things, plus a bit of ingenuity and a bit of incentive, made Europeans cross the oceans. Now, in doing so, to be sure, they wreaked a certain amount of havoc. They mistreated large numbers of people. They deprived people of many of their own possessions and resources and opportunities. But in the process as well, they initiated the making of our world a smaller, but also a more interesting and interdependent place. To walk down a street and to see a string of foreign restaurants is something we take very much for granted. And it's a very small manifestation of the consequences of European expansion. And it is not something that would have been met in the Europe of the 16th century. One great scholar once said that history is a process of challenge and response. One very interesting way of thinking back through the history of Western civilization is to list the challenges and list the responses. It is to notice, I think, an engaging, sometimes a surprising similarity in the challenges, and then to notice a most satisfying and curious dissimilarity in responses. There, I think, is where we see creativity and ingenuity. This is why it seems to me we can think of Western civilization not something fixed, done, and final, but as a great experiment, and as a great experiment that goes on. What challenges remain? I think they will be many of the same ones that have existed in the past. How may we live in peace with one another? How may we live on this planet without destroying it? How may we understand ourselves? But what responses will those challenges evoke? These are new, and they are unforeseen as of now. One last time, I invite you to stop the clock and think, on the basis of what you now know of Western civilization, what do you think is going to happen next? Next can mean the period from, let us say, 1600 until the dawning third millennium. Or next can mean the third millennium looming before us.